Awesome. Thank you very much. That was a great introduction. So for this talk, speaking on canary tokens, we're going to begin with a little bit of background. We're going to define what makes a good canary token. Then we're going to kind of design one theoretically based on some of those principles that we talked about. And then we're going to look at like how does this actually function in a real environment, right? I'm going to go into a little bit more details later, but I was able to deploy them in an actual environment to kind of prove out whether these are actual, whether the principles held, so to speak. Real quick, a disclaimer from my legal department. This is my own personal research, not that of my employer, so please don't be like, Microsoft said we could do this and just be safe forever, because they will not like that. We'll just say that much. Again, for yourself, if you're thinking about deploying any canary tokens, honey pots, make sure you get approval from your legal team, too. We already had a good introduction on me. Senior security engineer at Microsoft. I've been focused more on the offensive security side of things recently, doing pen testing, red teaming, purple teaming, but before that I was also doing digital forensics. This is a tweet from Florian Roth, and I think it does a really great job kind of encapsulating this current trend that we have seen, right? He does a really good job pointing out that like there's been a paradigm shift that has already taken place and kind of is taking place, and that's that attackers are much more focused on these cloud intrusions now. They're staying off of endpoints. EDR was a big reason for that, right? And detection in the cloud is difficult, like very noisy. Logging can be tough. There's different licensing tiers for everything, right? But we don't just have to kind of rely on anecdotal evidence about how this shift has happened. CrowdStrike, I think last week, just released this report, and they had a lot of good data on that. Specifically, from their perspective, they're claiming that cloud intrusions increased 136% in 2025, just the first half of 2025, compared to all of 2024. So obviously, a significant increase there. They saw a big increase from these China Nexus adversary groups as well, like up to 40%. And again, to kind of bring home the point, 81% of these intrusions were malware free. So again, pretty interesting. So the shift has happened. How can we, from like a defensive perspective, begin to deal with this? And I think that canary tokens, right, can provide effective early alerting, specifically on post-compromise activity, specifically in these Microsoft 365 environments. So again, why post-compromise specifically? Well, we'll have some threat intelligence blogs later, but if there is a set of actions we have very high confidence an adversary is going to take after initial access, that is a perfect place for us to put these canary tokens for early alerting, right? So just a little bit of background, right? We're talking about these cyber deception methods. We'll do a quick, we'll distinguish very quickly honeypots from honey tokens, canary tokens. Honey tokens are generally like larger. These are decoy systems designed to like attract attackers. And you'll see they're really good at developing threat intelligence. People are going to log behavior and monitor those. You can see those, they'll be put outside of IP space, externally facing, right? Honey tokens and canary tokens, I'll use that term interchangeably, right? They're different. These are more discrete pieces of data, right? We're talking about API keys, credentials, documents, and these really function a little bit more as like tripwires, right? When we see an attacker interact with them, we're ideally going to have an alert that is triggered, which will make us kind of aware of their activity. But first, like what makes a good canary token? If we're going to talk about developing one and testing one, these are some of the key pieces of information or key kind of elements we need to speak to, right? The first is attractive. If it's not attractive to attackers, they're not going to reach out and interact with it, right? So in essence, it's not serviceable at all, right? We need to make something that attackers are going to reach out, interact with, try to touch, try to enumerate. High fidelity, and this is a very key portion as well. we want to very clearly distinguish ourselves from like traditional SOC alerting, where we're going to need a lot of manual intervention if necessary, right? We definitely want to avoid alert fatigue. We want to have very high fidelity and high confidence alerts that when these are triggered, this is an actual event. Non-invasive, we don't want to disrupt our environment, again, because canary tokens are deployed. We're going to deploy them amongst like real assets in the environment, right? So we don't want it to disrupt the environment. We don't want to cause any type of harm. And we also don't want to be distracting. We'd rather not have users talk about this or interact with our tokens either. And finally, if we're thinking about this as a solution to be able to have a lot of companies, a lot of organizations begin to adopt this, we want to make it native. We don't want additional tiering, additional licensing, additional tools, third-party tools to use. Ideally, this is something that we can implement with the telemetry that we already have. So now that we've kind of defined those main criteria, let's begin to address these one by one and build out that like hypothetical canary token. So this is a blog from Mystic, Microsoft's Threat Intelligence Center. I think this does a really good job and is an example of what some of these actors are looking for post-compromise, right? This one is on Void Blizzard specifically. There's a couple more below, but they are trolling through users' mailboxes once they get that initial access, and they're also looking into shared mailboxes. Very interesting. Again, enumerating files on SharePoint. They're looking for things that help them expand their access. Again, it's pretty intuitive, but they're looking for credentials, keys, any information on remote monitoring tools. Again, this is not just specific to these espionage threat actors. Business email compromise, obviously we see a lot of that same type of activity, but they're searching for financial information, invoices, things like DocuSign. So what's our determination on the attractive? We know that attackers want the data, right? So we know, again, in these M365 environments, where that data lives. It's going to be in Exchange, Teams, and SharePoint. So these actors, once they get initial access to the environment, they're going to be searching for those things. So that sounds like a great location for our canary tokens, and we can begin to build it out. For this instance, we're going to use Outlook as our destination. So we're going to build our canary token, design it for that one. I've also done Teams and SharePoint, but those will have to be kind of included later on. So I'm sure people have heard of Things Canary, and there's other like canary token providers, right? And they have a free tier and the paid tier. I have no insight into the paid service at all, but I think most people are familiar with. You go to that site, you register a link, it'll be in their IP space, and you can put that inside of an email, document, other places as well. For this instance, right, we can compare the usage of just this like regular link to some of the criteria that we've already defined. We can maybe get a sense for maybe it's not the most ideal. For one, like you have the potential, if we're talking about emails, to notify the users. That's not, that's a little more invasive potentially than we'd like. It'll also be visible to users if we're putting a link inside an email. Again, that increases the likelihood that they might stumble across it, click it, just as a one-off. Then again, even though it's a quick setup, right, you have to use a different third-party tool, maybe not as simple for all like sysadmins or people at a small company to manage. The other thing that is interesting about using a link for this is that it's adding extra steps for the attackers, right? If we're thinking about some of the higher tradecraft threat actors, they're going to be a lot more conscious about which links they click. They're going to expect them beforehand, and then a lot of them will also probably look at them in sandbox environments, right? And they're going to have a very clear idea about what address space or DNS they're allowing to resolve. So again, if we want to make this as precise as possible, it would be great to remove steps the threat actors have to take as well, which is what we're going to try to do. So one potential solution I came across when doing this research was hidden folders, hidden mailbox folders. It's not something I was familiar with before, but there is a property for these mailbox folders that you can set that will make it hidden. This blog listed below does a really great job going through it. There's a couple different ways to do it. One of them is using the Graph API. So using the Graph API, if you specify that field specifically upon creation, you can't do it after the fact, but upon creation, you can create that as a hidden folder. And this means it makes it kind of invisible to the user when they're using the application or the Outlook web app. Okay, that's kind of interesting, right? But how does that help us in our design? Well, what's interesting is you can't see that folder, but if you put an email inside of the folder, that email is still searchable. Still searchable via the GUI in the application, and it's also searchable via like some of these post-exploitation tools like Graph Runner. So this is looking a little bit better, right? 'Cause if we create in Canary email with some of those keywords that we lay out, we'll have to be precise about which ones would be more or less likely to be accidentally searched in a regular user's email inbox. We can then kind of abstract that or hide it away from the user. But how would we monitor for these access events? Well, we can use the mail items accessed operation inside the unified audit log to be able to do that, right? If anyone is familiar, it's a super well-known operation, right? It's very, very high volume because it's recording access like when users access emails. And of course, that's regular behavior for users. But what we can do is monitor the specific internet message ID of our Canary email using this operation to see if our Canary email has been accessed, right? So we went over a couple different things, right? But very generally, in a simple way, this is how we could create our test Canary based on some of these different types of data we looked at, right? We'll create a hidden folder. We'll then send an email with some of these specific keywords. Again, like remote monitoring and management tools are a good example of this if you're not using them in your environment, right? Would you have Bob from like sales be looking for AnyDesk? Like that seems potentially unlikely. We'll move that email to the hidden folder, and then we'll constantly pull the unified audit log looking for mail items access events. And if we find one that's happened, right, that will be our trigger to go and begin to investigate. Again, like theoretically and for testing, it's fine, but it's tough to simulate real user behavior. So the good news was I have a friend of mine, right, he owns his company. I occasionally help him out with, I check out security things when he gets worried about stuff. And he allowed me to demo these canaries in his environment. Again, it's a small business, less than 50 people. They have sales engineers, they have marketing, a bunch of different functions, right? They're cloud native. They don't have any presence on-prem. And what we did is we deployed this particular type of canary for a subset of users in his company, right? We split it up into 2 different groups, and we're doing like an initial 4-week trial, which will be ending in like tomorrow, actually, right? This will be the end of the 4 weeks. So that's great. What are our results? This graph here is showing the number of events over that 1-month time period. The 2 lines are the 2 different groups. On the vertical axis, we have the number of access events, right? And then the bottom, we have overtime. What we want to see is a bunch of zeros, right? I want 0 mail items access events unless there's an actual intrusion. So the results are kind of interesting. We can kind of chop these up into 3 different sections. The first one is the initial deployment, right? On days 1 and days 2. That makes sense because I am creating the email, I'm sending it, I'm moving it around, so obviously we're gonna see those mail items access events for that portion, right? That's just the initial deployment. Now, on days 4 and days 6, respectively, 1 for each of the different groups that we were testing in, we had 1 event each. Looking into it a little bit more, it was more of a kind of like residual syncing to other devices, right? Again, these happened within the first week, trying to initially baseline. So All right, I'm not super worried about those. Those aren't ideal. But this one event on day 13 kind of stood out, right? That's past that initial first week. All of the days around it, we have like 0 access events, right? So I spent a lot of time looking into this specifically. And frankly, I could talk about this single event for 20 minutes by itself. But digging into it a little bit more, it turns out that the user who was responsible for this event had actually just gotten fired that week, right? So doing a little bit of digging, the number of events, right, total mail items access events wasn't wildly different, but there was an increase during that time. It appears like my current hypothesis is this person was going through email prior to losing access, right? And I think there was an errant hit on that email. Also, the application that was used to do this was a Microsoft first-party application, which is good, right? We want to see, but was unable to resolve that application ID, which is very weird, right? But you don't always have service principals like available for every single app that is actually in your tenant, which is a little bit odd, but I was able to validate that with someone much smarter than me. So again, we'll take that. So how did we do based on our definitions, right? Attractive, we decided on Outlook. I think it's, again, all pretty clear that if an attacker gets access, they do some adversary in the middle type attack, they're gonna go through someone's email. Non-invasive, we're using hidden folders to kind of abstract or hide that email away from the user to try and decrease the likelihood that they just accidentally find it. Again, we had a lot of days with 0 access events, so I'm pretty happy about that. Native, unified auto log, we did not have to use any additional logging. We didn't have to, enable any different licensing. We're able to use what was available to everyone. And then high fidelity, right? This was the one I wanted to validate the most. Again, it's not perfect. That one event there, I wish was not there, but also was pretty interesting. Because as we're talking about these canary tokens from the perspective of early detection and alerting from like a compromise event, they can also be pretty useful from like an insider threat perspective, right? And kind of changing the benefit or adding an additional benefit. If we're seeing someone crawling a SharePoint or crawling emails, especially if it's a shared inbox potentially, right, we can use that as, again, a data point into looking further into problems that we might have. Okay, great. So just to kind of wrap up, again, this is a tweet from Florian in that same thread, and I think it does a really good job. So like attackers, threat actors, they've made this transition, right? They've made this evolution. A lot of them, not everyone, right? There's still, obviously, this is a generalization I'm making. There's still people that conduct like traditional, campaigns, but a large amount have already made that transition. So detection and response also need to evolve along with that. I think that implementing and employing some of these cyber deception methods like canary tokens, making them as simple as possible, making them low friction as possible, will allow us to provide that as an option to small businesses or companies that do not have like a dedicated cybersecurity team, right? So trying to change that paradigm of thinking of some of these adversary deception, cyber deception methods that are kind of like a nice to have or an add-on at the end of after you've checked all the other boxes. If we can begin to implement that earlier or even in the architecture phase, I think for the cloud specifically, we'll see a lot of benefit for that. Okay, that is my portion of the talk. That is my contact information. Feel free to add me, hit me up if you're interested in this, if you have experience with these canaries in your environment. I'd love to hear about it, love to talk about it, love to get any of your thoughts or experience. And if you see me walking around or if I'm here after for the questioning, feel free and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.